everyone, thanks for watching. My name is Nikki LaFoyle, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make these triangle or pyramid shaped pattern weights. So they're filled with rice to give them their weight so that they hold your pattern down onto your fabric. Because sometimes it is not ideal to have to be pinning your pattern down to your fabric. And some people never pin their pattern to their fabric. They exclusively use pattern weights because when you do pin your pattern to your fabric, it does create a little bump, which can sometimes result in inaccurate cutting at your edges. So pattern weights are a super handy tool to have in your sewing room. And I love these cute, colorful pattern weights that you can make from scraps from your stash. So pattern weights, they're available to buy in a bunch of different shapes. These are the ones that I had. They're heavy and they're low profile, but they're not that cute. You know, you can use cans of tuna for pattern weights. I've used baking ramekins before, but they're just not that cute. So making your own is a fun way to have this tool around and use up some fun, pretty fabrics from your stash. So it's a really easy project. I have full instructions for you to download in a PDF that will be linked in the description of this video. And also you can scan the QR code on your screen to download that PDF and save it for later. But I'm going to take you through the steps in this video on how to make our cute little pattern weights. So the pattern weight that is this size, you know, it's a hand size. This is made with an 8x4-inch rectangle. You can play around with sizes a little bit. This one, my little mini, so you can see the size difference here. It's a lot smaller. This one was made using a 6x3-inch rectangle. And it's not as heavy because there's not as much volume for the rice, but it's still heavy enough to hold the pattern to your fabric. And it's nice to have a little bit of a variety of sizes because this is good for smaller pattern pieces. It's good for getting into the corners of pattern pieces. So I like having, you know, some little ones, and you can play around with sizes even more. Just make sure you keep that 2-to-1 ratio. So, you know, 8x4 or 6x3, you know, your 2-to-1 inch ratio. And I wouldn't go much smaller than this, my 3x6 rectangle, because like I mentioned, the smaller it is, the less volume you have for the rice, so it's not as heavy. And also this tiny little rectangle, when you're stitching it, it can get a little fiddly. We're turning things right side out, and it can be a little bit tricky with smaller seams, smaller, you know, edges. So I wouldn't go much smaller than this, but you can definitely play around with sizes. So the other supply we'll need, in addition to our fabric scrap and our rice, is a ribbon. It's actually, you don't need it. It is optional, but this ribbon is kind of nice to be able to, you know, grab your pattern weights. Not necessary. You can just grab them. But if you have some ribbon, it is kind of nice. So I just have a 1/4-inch satin ribbon, and I've got about 5 inches of it. You can use 1/2-inch ribbon, whatever you have. It's just going to be inserted in the side seam here. And you could make your own ribbon out of fabric if you want. It is totally up to you. So you'll also want a funnel to insert your rice into your pattern weight. You could probably do it without, but it just makes it a lot easier. So you'll need a hand sewing needle and thread to stitch up our opening that we're going to leave. After we fill it with rice, we'll be hand stitching it closed. And that's all we need. So all stuff you probably already have in your house. So I'm going to swap my camera over and we're going to get started stitching. So I've got my 8x4-inch rectangle, and quilting cotton is perfect for this because it is stable and strong. As you know, these are getting thrown around in your sewing room. So I have 8x4. And I'm going to fold this in half with right sides together. Hello, Esther, watching from the Netherlands. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to, so this is folded in half. And at this fold here, I'm just going to crease it just with my thumbnail, just to mark the center. And I'm going to take my ribbon, fold it in half so that the short edges are matching. And I'm going to align it right at this fold so that the edge of my ribbon is at the crease. And then we're going to refold this over, matching up our raw edges so that that ribbon is just right in there. It's lying flat right at that crease. And we're going to stitch this edge that has the ribbon in it. So we're going to go from the fold over, pivot at the corner, and stitch down. And we're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to leave this bottom edge open for now. So I'm starting at the fold. Wanda mentions that these are going to be great for when you're working with leather and vinyl, because you can't really pin your pattern to those fabrics, since once you put a hole in leather or vinyl, that hole stays there. And they're kind of thicker material, so the thicker the material, the more difficult it is when you try to pin your pattern to the fabric. It's tricky to pin to a thicker fabric. Okay, so I am going to clip the corners off of this, the edges. The edge that has the ribbon in it, I'm going to clip a little bit. I'm going to clip this corner that we stitched around. Now I'm going to open this up. And actually, before we open it up, I'm going to use my thumbnail again just to make sure I have a center crease down here at this lower edge, because we're going to match that crease to our seam. I'm going to open up my seam, match it to that center crease. Oops. Open that up, match it to the center crease I just made. Now, when we stitch this edge, we want to leave an opening for turning. So my opening is going to be right around here. We need like an inch and a half. So I'm going to stitch a little bit of this edge so that I'm not trying to, fold this corner in. And I want to stop and leave my opening before I get to my seam. And it's fine if, you want to leave your center opening centered over this seam. It's just when we turn it right side out, and then when we're trying to hand stitch the opening closed, I like to not have to deal with the seam allowances. Just a personal preference, but it's totally doable if that is what you end up doing. And I had to do it for my smaller size anyway, because there was just not the real estate on this seam to avoid these seam allowances. So I am going to stitch, again, using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch about 1 inch right here, and then I'm going to jump, leave an opening, and I'm going to stitch the rest of the seam. And I'm going to back stitch at each end of my opening. And we're back stitching at the beginning and end of the opening so that when we go to turn things right side out, our seam doesn't start unraveling. There we go. Just had to make sure I had enough bobbin thread left. All right. So I'm stitching just a little bit. I'm going to back stitch or lock that stitch. Leave a little opening. Start again. Lock the stitch. And then stitch the remainder of the seam. All right. Trim my threads, clip these remaining corners. All right, now we have this little opening right here. I'm going to reach my finger in and I'm going to try to grab my ribbon. So this is another good reason to have your ribbon because it helps you turn this right side out. All right, now we want to poke out our corners. If you have a point turner or a knitting needle or a pencil, and get my corners pushed out. All right, so our pyramid is taking shape here. We just need to add some rice to it to give it its weight. So I'm going to insert funnel into the opening. And I've got about half a cup of dry uncooked rice. So that's going to fill up the pattern weight that's made with an 8x4 inch rectangle. I would not recommend trying to fill this up so much that, you know, it's a struggle to hand stitch it closed. So there's going to be some empty space in it, and that's fine. All right. Now, the last step is to stitch this opening closed. So I've got my hand sewing needle and thread, and we're just going to do a little slip stitch here to close this up. So I'm folding my seam allowances in 1/4 inch so that we have a straight edge right across here. So I've got a knot in my one end, and I am going to start by tucking my knot under the seam allowance. So I'm threading my needle up under the seam allowance. So that is where my knot is tucked down in. Azalea says, this looks like a great project for teaching kids. And that's a great idea. It is, because it is straight lines, straight seams, but you start with a rectangle and you end up with this this dimensional thing, which is super cool for kids to see that, with fabric and thread and a little technique, you can make some really fun stuff. So I'm just going back and forth from fold to fold. This is the slip stitch or the ladder stitch. If it winds up being more of like a whip stitch, that's totally fine. All we're trying to do here is close up this opening and keep our rice from spilling out. So I like to make my stitches fairly small here. And then a knot off my thread. And before I clip my thread, I'm going to push my needle through to somewhere else, just like an inch away. And I'm going to pull gently and then clip my thread so that the end of my thread then disappears down in to the project. So my edge is all finished up. So I've got my rice in here so it has enough weight to hold my pattern down onto my fabric for cutting it out. So these pattern weights are super handy to have around. And like I said, you're going to have some open space or some empty space in here. And that is totally fine. We have this, big layer of rice on the bottom, and you don't want to try filling this up all the way because it's going to be really tricky to hand stitch that last seam closed. So just be okay with that. And that's enough weight for our purposes. So quick and easy project, and a great stash buster. Like I said, I love saving all of my tiny little squares and rectangles of fabric because it's so pretty and cute, and I'm gonna definitely find a way to use it somehow. So this is a great use for that. Jeannie mentioned that a great use for fabric scraps. Absolutely. So next time your husband says, why do you have all these fabric scraps? You can say, this is why. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy the project, and make yourself some of these super easy pattern weights to use for cutting out your patterns for super accurate cuts. Thanks again. Have a great day.